Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Why advising only gets tougher? Everybody thinks that advice is something that is simple. Everybody thinks that giving advice is not difficult in the present. Everybody thinks that advice is something very obvious. A lot of people actually think that there is no need for advice. People with lesser experience tend to believe that they don't need advice. Ironically, the most experienced investors are always looking for advice, while the newbies think they can manage on their own. Advice has never been more controversial now than ever before. You have to understand that people are viewing advice from the prism of only one variable, and that is cost. But anyone who seeks advice knows that the benefits have to be weighed against the cost. Unfortunately, in the investment world, most people consider only returns as the primary benefit. But when you get advice from somebody, and for a moment forget about financial advice, any advice, let's say you get life advice, career advice, you generally do not value such advice in monetary terms. For example, if you took career advice from a person and he made you choose a job which gave you faster career growth, he made you join a correct company and made you stick to that company through his wise counsel, you don't attribute the value of that advice based on how much ESOPs you got or what remuneration you got. You just respect the advice in a qualitative way. But that's not the case with financial advice. For some reason, people think that financial advice is everything quantitative. It's just numbers that matter to most people. In the process, investors start underappreciating and undervaluing certain critical aspects of advice. For example, if advice gives you tremendous clarity, ample peace of mind, and a superior investment ownership experience, these are essentially qualitative factors. In fact, these are factors which create better returns. If you don't have these factors, you're probably going to be found behaviorally wanting with your investment. If you don't have these aspects as a function of advice or an outcome of advice, you are going to behave impulsively, rashly, under some difficult circumstance or the other. So these aspects are actually more valuable than simple financial outcomes because they create the outcome, and without them there cannot be a great financial outcome. But most people think these don't matter, only the financial outcome matters, and which is why despite taking advice, a lot of people don't get the desired outcomes. As an advisor, I have seen one category of investors. They would take advice, but they would just take the advice on face value. Sometimes they would refuse to action that advice because they find something that is not agreeing with their advice somewhere in the public space, maybe in social media. Or they have their own baggage of emotions and experiences which stop them from accepting that advice. Under those circumstances, people do not translate advice into action. And advice is mostly documented, right? So you cannot escape facing that fact that you refused an advice later. Effectively, if the outcome of the advice was very good and you had refused it, the investor tends to build a defense mechanism. Often, blaming is part of this defense mechanism. So they try to externalize their poor choice or decision and not measure the opportunity loss. For example, let's say an advisor gives 7 decisions or 7 suggestions or 7 specific advice reports or 7 instances of advice. Out of these 7, the investor picks only 4, he fails to pick 3. These 3 turn out to be the best advice that the advisor has given. The investor tends to say that returns are bad without factoring in the opportunity loss that he has suffered because of his decision not to follow the qualitatively better advice, which created better quantitative outcome. So the onus of advice often is mistaken to be solely with the advisor, whereas it is not. The advice is non-discretionary. The investor has to act on it. He has full discretion. Advisor doesn't have the discretion. So the decision discretion is a bigger part of the advisory process than the advice itself. And the investor often tries to kind of make light of his poor decision discretion. And this is why today advice is becoming more and more complex and difficult, because investors are exercising very strong decision discretion even on the best advice. And this decision discretion is not helping improve the outcome, which is why advisors often face a thankless job of being answerable for the decisions made by their customers. Discretionary advice is a much needed thing, but for some reason, we do not want to give that discretion to the advisor, and we want discretionary advice to be only delivered through the PMS route, which makes the entire advisory ecosystem look vulnerable, weak, and always based on how they are able to convince investors and at the mercy of the investors' responsibility and discretion. So, his actions, but your judgments. His discretion and indiscretion, but your outcome. This kind of a conflict is constantly there in advice, which makes it very complex. And it's only becoming more and more complex because the investor is becoming more and more complex. So, this is not an easy time to receive advice or to give advice, because discretion is dominating advice and the advisor simply doesn't own any of it. Remember this point the next time you're critical of advice and try to factor these things into your judgments. Thank you for your patience and for watching this video.